There you go.
Thank you. Well, I think I should introduce myself before anything. My name is Samuel Marein-Efron. I was born in Budapest on May 5th, 1933, which is about 4 months after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. I lived to the age of 7 in Budapest, and basically somebody asked me how we were able to survive till 1941 in Budapest. Truthfully, the title of the talk, which is the center of the storm, or the eye of the storm, actually it was Hungary was the eye of the storm. It was sort of a somewhat quiet spot in a Europe which was in turmoil already several years. There was in Austria the Anschluss, where Austria became Germany again. There was in France the Pétain government. It went down the whole area. After 1940, let's say, it was really difficult to live in Europe. And basically my father was a textile technician, and he was a consultant to various firms. And one of the things that they sold, the biggest item, was what you refer today as Loden cloth. In other words, at that time that was a military cloth sold to all the armies in Europe. And the reason I say this is that basically my father and my father's firms were, should we say, closely related to Germany in many ways, because they were one of the major customers of the company. Another part of the company, which was also military, was weapons production and aluminum, especially for aircraft. Hungary was the biggest producer of aluminum in Europe, and the head of our company, which was Vice Manfred von Cheppel, who was Jewish, was one of the biggest suppliers to the German aeronautical industry. What I'm trying to tell you is basically that Hungary tried to balance itself between being a friend of Germany and being relatively independent. And even though Horthy is today considered to be part of the Hitler clique, I would say that Horthy, to a great extent, was able to keep Hitler out of Hungary at least till 1943. It's the people who stayed after 1943 that the troubles really began. And our troubles began in 1939. We had, my family used to go away for a full month before school started to a spa, usually. And my father, of course, didn't go with us. He came maybe for a few days, and then he went on business. And in this case, he was on business in Paris. When we were in, of all places, in a place called Zapopan, which is a spa which is on the Polish Slovak border inside Poland. It's on the Polish side of the divide. And this used to be a place where we could go for a full month, and there was activities for the children, and there was activities for the grown-ups. And my father was in Paris. We were end of August, and my father called up, I think it was the 29th of August, and told my mother, you know, get your things together and get out of there. Why? He said, the rumors here is that Hitler and Stalin are signing a pact, and once the pact is signed, he says the war will begin, and just get out of it. I don't know how my mother was able to arrange it, but she packed us up and moved us back to Budapest. And through, as my father had predicted, we were on the last train out of Zapopan. And the war began, and there was no more Poland left. Poland was divided between the Germans, the Russians, and the old Austro-Hungarian was called the Generalgouvernement, which was controlled by the Germans. But Poland as such ceased to exist. And here is where our difficulties began, because even though we were separated, we tried to get together. My father couldn't come into Hungary because he had to go through Germany, and Germany no longer recognized Polish passports. And we couldn't get out of it for the same reason. So my father had, through a long adventure, it took him almost 6 months. He had gone from one port to the other trying to get a boat to the United States, even though he didn't have a visa, by the way. He had applied for one, but his number theoretically had not been called. And the reason he applied for one is that he was getting, should we say, he's German. He had one German client, a very big one, who was the biggest manufacturer of children's dresses in Germany, who said, get out of Europe. What Hitler is saying about and finishing with the Jews, he means it. And it's time that you have to, I still have a letter. You know, at that time, typewriters had two colors, either black or red. The place that it says, this is no time for you to be in Hungary, get out of here, is in red. And my father had also his clients in Germany who were, one was even a field marshal in the German army. He basically told him as well, he says, this is no time for a Jew to be in Europe. He says, go away for a year or two, some sort of an arrangement will be made with Hitler, and then you will all be able to come back. My father took it semi-seriously because he applied for an American visa. He also, this man, this German, Albert Zenger, went to Mexico, and he actually got a visa, a Mexican visa for my father as well, a visa which was actually had to be renewed every 6 months because my father really didn't have any ideas of going until the separation. The separation, he was trying to get out of Europe. And this was a very, very difficult. We finally managed to get some sort of a arrangement of traveling through Yugoslavia to Greece, and from Greece to Italy, and making a connection from there to New York. But the day we were about to leave, and my mother had already sold her furniture and whatever it is, and we were all prepared for going, Italy invaded Greece. And that was the end of that. There were no possibilities after that because you had to go through German-occupied territories, and that became a very, very difficult issue. By luck, my father, well, he finally got onto a boat in Lisbon by a sheer accident. He was sitting in a coffee shop, and he was listening to a conversation on the next table, and it seems that somebody had gotten sick and who had a cabin on a boat leaving for New York, and that he wouldn't be able to make the boat. So my father basically ran to the shipping company and, of course, bribed somebody to get this man's cabin, and actually had to be bribed quite generously because he didn't have an American visa, which would put the shipping company in jeopardy whenever he got to New York. And he finally got to New York on this boat and spent the first week at Ellis Island. Ellis Island was still in operation. His brother was able to get him a 3-week stay. In those 3 weeks, he was able to get his Mexican visa, and he went to Mexico. And then the problem was to get us out. The problem was basically getting us some sort of a document which would be acceptable to European transit people. The Polish passport wasn't. So finally, by the sheerest of luck, the lawyer that my father had in Mexico was very friendly with an admiral of the Mexican Navy who had been on a war game with Horthy about 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier, when Horthy was an admiral of the Austro-Hungarian Navy. And he sent a letter to Horthy saying, please help, these are the family of a friend of mine. Please help these people. So she was called to the palace, to the Horthy Palace across the Danube, and she was helped. She was actually given what was called a League of Nations passport, a Nansen passport. And with this Nansen passport, she was able to get a transit visa to Germany, through Austria, through actually unoccupied France, the southern part of France, the Vichy France. Northern France was occupied by the Germans. Spain. In Spain, we took a boat to Lisbon, and in Lisbon, my mother had to pull out a Polish passport to get her Mexican visa, because theoretically the Mexicans only would stamp on a Polish passport. They were the only ones that still recognized Poland. So these adventures and misadventures took from September of 1939 to April of 1941. And I would say that, as I said before, it was a shock that Germany became the Germany that was, because my sister went to German school. I was supposed to go into the first grade of the German school as well. When we got back from vacation, that was already, it became very apparent that the Nazis didn't want to have Jews in the school. So we were told that our registration was canceled, and I spent my first year of school in a Jewish primary school, because it was first grade, and my sister had to spend also her last year of schooling in a Jewish secondary school in Budapest. It was really the relationship between in the same way that people in Mexico look towards the United States for their culture and their, should we say, it's the big brother that we would like to imitate. Germany used to be always in the same position in Hungary. I mean, not only was it the Jewish population, but much of the Hungarian population, who were ethnic Germans, by the way, looked on to Germany for. We basically are a family, of course, who had all kinds of experiences. My first cousin, a very close first cousin, my father and her father were business partners for many, many years, besides having a common sibling for spouse. Was caught in Czechoslovakia. She had been denied entrance to the medical school in Poland because of the numerus clausus. There was a very small amount of Jews allowed in, especially in medicine and law, and she couldn't make the cut. So she went to Charles University in Czechoslovakia, and she was caught. 1939 caught her there, and she had to stay. She stayed the whole war in Europe. She was helped by the director of my father's company in Czechoslovakia with papers, false papers, and she was also she spoke very good German. So for a while she was actually the contact between the Czech underground and the Czech underground people who were taken in by the Germans and jailed. She posed as a doctor, which she was, and she became the main contact between the jailed resistance fighters and their families. She eventually, at the end of the war, about 8 months before the end of the war, she decided that she couldn't bear this anymore. So she actually walked into Gestapo headquarters and said, "If you're looking for Jews, I am a Jew as well." And of course that got her sent off to Auschwitz, Birkenau, where she was spared because she was a physician, and physicians were needed for the German population, not only for the prisoner population. So she spent the rest of the war in Gross Rosen, which is a satellite camp of Auschwitz. And basically, again, her knowledge of German and saved her made her survive the war. The rest of the family was not as lucky. Her brother and father and mother died in Treblinka, but the rest of my family were either in Russia or had emigrated to the old Palestine mandate or to the United States. So basically our family survived, I would say, well into the 80% of our. This is basically our story, but I'm sure that you have other questions and other interests of what happened there, and I'm ready to try to answer these questions.
Have you written memoir or anything about your experiences?
Well, my sister was 92 years ago, So we decided to write something. We have written it, and it needs very badly editing. And it not only is written, but we have a lot of... My mother was a hoarder. My mother was a terrible hoarder.
That's good news.
Believe it or not, in 1941, we traveled through war-torn Europe with 19 pieces of baggage, including 3 or 4 steamer trunks. And how she managed to get it through was, there's even an interesting story there. The Spanish customs were trying to be very nasty. They wanted to have an inventory and this and that. And my sister, totally innocently pulled a chocolate tablet from her pocket and offered it to the inspector. She didn't realize that the man had not seen a chocolate bar probably in 3 or 4 years. So the man grabbed the chocolate bar and had us go through the... Yes?
Could you talk about your experience while in Mexico? What it was like to be a Jewish immigrant in a Mexican country?
Well,
Were you in Mexico City?
well, we started off being in Puebla. My father arrived and he asked, you know, where is there a textile town in Mexico? So they told him Puebla. So he started the first wool textile mill in Puebla. There were, I don't know, 100 cotton mills, and he was the first one. But it was a good decision because it was a place where you could find a lot of technically capable people. And it really made my father's transition much, much easier. As far as I found a lot of friendly reception, certainly from the population around me. The government has always been a pain in the whatever it is, and they were always asking you for all kinds of things. My father had actually arrived on the investor visa. At that time, you had to show $20,000 and promise to invest that into Mexico. And that's how he got a visa. And they made all kinds of demands from him every 6 months that he had to prove that he gave work to X number of people and so. But basically, the population was very friendly. It was a very, very friendly reception, I would say, on the whole.
Did you learn the language?
Excuse me?
Did you learn the language?
Well, I was 8 years old, so for about 4 or 5 more months, I didn't say a word. And on the 6th month, I had even forgotten Hungarian. I was speaking fluently by the 6th month, Spanish, but to the point that, yes, I did forget my Hungarian.
Was there a Jewish community in that area?
In Mexico?
In Puebla, where you were?
In Puebla, there were, I think, about 8 or 9 families, basically. But they were old immigration. There were people who had arrived in the 1920s. There was none of the new ones. The new immigrants, some of them stayed in places like Orizaba and Córdoba, and even Morelia. There used to be there was also a large group in Guadalajara and Monterrey, but I would say 90% of the new arrivals from Mexico City.
Well, I observed upstairs when you were looking at the Torah that you could recognize the Torah portions, and so you clearly had a strong Jewish education. Which was that from your father? I mean, how did that happen?
Basically, my mother. My mother was religious. My father was questionably so, even though he came from a very, very Orthodox background. One of the reasons we were in Zapopan is that it was one of the spas which had a Jewish hotels and restaurants and all kinds of amenities. Luchachovich in the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia was another one very similar. Marein-Efron, all of these spas and bathing places had huge Jewish arrangements, hotels and restaurants. So, you know, you could a kosher life.
So when we were, for those that don't know, we do have a Czech Torah upstairs as part of our exhibit, but you were telling a story about your family Torah, which I thought was charming, if you would repeat that for the group.
Well, the eldest brother of my father was a rabbi, the only one in the family that followed my grandfather's profession. There was a Torah in the family. I have no idea who had it, but he managed somehow to get it out of Poland. And he first went to Sweden, and he was for about 5 or 6 years in Sweden. And then he moved to Israel. At that time, it was the Palestine Mandate. And he became an antiquarian. And one of the prized pieces of his antiquarian store was basically this Torah, which came to me through his daughter. And it is now being used by the family. As a matter of fact, one of my grandson, my eldest grandson, David, is going to have his bar mitzvah in, what is it, May?
In June.
June. And he will read out of this Torah his portion. It's, but as I say, my uncle became actually a very, very big antiquarian in the area. And more than that, he was also the founder of the Bezalel art, one of the founders of the Bezalel art school in Jerusalem. And as I say, it's the one piece of family lore which has survived us very well, besides the bits and pieces that my mother took along. I mean, just as an example, I think my mother had a pot which was given on her trousseau when she got married. That pot got to Mexico. Yes, she was that much of a collector.
How long were you in Mexico and where do you live now?
Well, I lived in Mexico from 1941 to 1995, which is 54 years. And because of the security problems in Mexico, I moved to Bethesda in Maryland in 1995, thanks to my wife, she's a New Yorker.
And we have 3 children who were born in Mexico and who attended the American school, where Mr. Blum was the director, and Rebecca Martinez Blum was also on the faculty, as was Lois Mayer. And Sam is a product of the American school. Why don't you go back from Puebla, and I'm not sure how long you lived in Puebla. Hearing about
Very,
that.
very little.
Okay, so why don't you talk about your education in Mexico and how the environment of being in a Catholic cosmopolitan city.
Well, again, my mother was not a big lover of small towns. Originally, my father was in Žilina, which is a small town in Slovakia on the Slovak-Polish border, where actually the biggest textile factory that Chappell used to own was, and he used to spend 3 days in Budapest, but he lived in Žilina. My mother decided that she wouldn't have a child being born in some backwoods town in anywhere, so she forced my father to move to Budapest. In the same way, she forced my father to move from Puebla to Mexico City. And part of the problem was what Diane said. In Puebla, there was more of a religious issue. Puebla happens to be an extraordinarily conservative, old Catholic town with, at that time, very definite borders between not only the white population, the white Catholic population, but the indigenous browner population. There was one university for should we say the white criollos, which was the St. Charles University in Puebla, and there was the University of Puebla, which was basically for, and they had different curriculum, and my mother did not like basically you were either in a society or you were out. And my mother just couldn't stand this for very long, and we moved to Mexico City. And there was a totally different, at that time especially, there was a different outlook. There was a great immigration of intellectuals from Europe at the time.
And how old were you then?
I was 8 to 9, I was 9 to 10. I had become aware of many things which an 8 or a 9-year-old does not become very clearly aware of today. But because of the situation, I was keenly aware of many of those things. It's, I mean, we were talking to Lois this morning about Christmas. I said, you know, the first Christmases in Mexico, they had no relationship to the Christmases that there are here today. Christmas was a religious holiday. It was a very, very religious holiday. No partying, no lights, no this, no that. And it was a very conservative community which really kept tabs on everybody. So this was another reason to move. Yes?
Yes, your family was very lucky. Your family had enough resources and contacts and so forth. And I'm wondering if your parents kept in touch with any of their other Jewish friends in Budapest, if they survived, and was there resentment on the part of these other friends who perhaps survived but not the way your family did? Do they keep in touch with old friends?
After the war, yes. In other words, we had notices of some of our people. As I say, we kept in contact with one of the directors of the company in Slovakia. He lived in Nitra, in Slovakia, and this is my cousin, actually, who was in Prague. She actually managed to smuggle herself across the border into Slovakia, which was an independent republic at that time, thanks to this man, and thanks to herself too. And he kept some tab, and we were getting regular mail through the Red Cross, tremendously redacted. I mean, there were big black redactions all over the place. But there were certain messages which were very clear that this and that person was still alive, or this and that. We kept we tried to reach almost, I would say, 2/3 of our friends after the war. And many of them did survive. They were hidden, in one case, in the factory that they worked at. In other cases, they had various good luck charms. It was difficult. The people in Hungary, I'll tell you, there was also a division. There was a big division with the city dwellers to the ones that lived outside. In other words, the Budapest people, they had a better chance of surviving than, let's say, the people in Miskolc, in the small towns of outside of Budapest, or Debrecen. And most of our friends were Budapest. I would say about half of them survived the war.
Sam, when we got to know each other in the 70s, 1970s in Mexico, my understanding was that quite a bit of Nazi immigration had taken place into Mexico. Can you speak about that? Was that your perception? I understood that some of the restaurants and stuff were run by Nazi sympathizers and
Well, there was a lot of Nazi sympathizers around. Not only in the German colony, but actually among the Mexicans themselves. And I would say basically in the very high-class Mexicans. It came to the point where the mantle in the homes were usually oil picture of the Virgin of Guadalupe was normally placed. The very, very upper Mexicans had Hitler placed on their mantles. Oil paintings of Adolf Hitler. And once in a while they still show up among the art dealers in Mexico. There was sympathy. There was never an organized Nazi movement in Mexico. For example, the people my father used to buy hardware were Nazis. I mean, to the point, there's a very big hardware store in Mexico. It was basically the biggest hardware supplier called Boker Hermanos, Boker Brothers. They actually flew a Nazi flag every morning at their business. And there were others. There was a group of people who used to make rubber packings called Bolbu Hermanos. Oh, there were a lot of Nazi sympathizers. After the war, they all said, gee whiz, it was a foolish thing on our part. And I will tell you to what point there were Nazi sympathizers. While we were in Puebla, there was a hotel called the Ritz. And it was on the other side of the well, it wasn't the municipal palace, it was actually the state government palace. It was on the corner of the Zócalo, which is the main square. On Friday evening, the German population of Puebla used to lock up the hotel, and they used to put on Nazi uniforms, and they used to have a Nazi meeting, with horse vessel songs, with German songs, but as a movement there was no serious, not like, for example, Argentina, where there was a very serious Nazi movement. But in Mexico there were sympathizers, but not.
Sam, having lived amongst the Mexicans in Mexico, and then coming to the United States, how do you perceive the president's current perception and what he's saying about Mexico and Mexicans now?
I'll tell you very truthfully, my feelings go beyond just Mexico and Mexicans. I have a great brotherhood with people who are persecuted for one reason or another, just because of their race or their national origin. And I feel that this is terrible. It shouldn't be. Though both sides have their faults. I mean, in Mexico, they have what they call Artículo 33, which is basically what our friend is now trying to do here, which is expel anybody without papers. In Mexico, there actually exists an article in the Constitution which allows the Mexican government to expel anybody without a trial, just at the whim of the Interior Department. But as I say, I am not friendly with either of them. I'm more friendly with people who are persecuted than.
Have you always spoken out about your experiences, about the Holocaust, about your family, about how it affected you?
Yes, I have. I'm basically, I would say I have been lucky that I have been always involved in groups of people who were, should we say, ready to hear the story and find out what it was about, whether it was here when I went to school at Harvard, or whether it was in Mexico. It was basically a very open and to a certain extent friendly society. You will always find the person who makes more noise than he should. But on the whole, I would say that my experience has been positive. Right.
What was your career in Mexico?
My career. My father built himself quite a textile group of factories, and he expanded into other areas, into steel fabrication, eventually into housing. And even though I was by profession a mathematician, and I wanted to continue my profession, but it was, at that time, you could not liquidate the business in Mexico. They used to say that you had one wife which you could divorce at any time, but in the factory you had 200 wives which you couldn't divorce under any circumstance. And this was the problem. I had to, when my father grew less capable of being able to run the place, I came back to Mexico.
I would talk a little about your experience at the Franco-Espanol, which was a Jesuit-run school, and what that was like.
Well, again, the school at that time was not Jesuit-run. It was run by a Jesuit who had left the Compañía de Jesús. Curiously enough, Jesuits have always been more, should we say, friendly to Jewish students than let's say Dominicans. And basically, the Franco-Espanol was in generally a very positive experience. I certainly learned Spanish in a way which I wouldn't have never learned it. Both an intellectual and a relationship which was very positive, very positive. Yes.
When you went to Harvard, you said Harvard?
Yes.
Was there any, did you run into any anti-Semitism there?
Yes. But it was not, not violent. It was, should we say, controlled. It was, the school basically said, look, we took you in because we wanted to hear your experience, and we want you to share, we want to share our experience with you, and we took you in because we felt that you could listen, and we are ready to listen. And I would say in 95% of the cases, this was the case. I probably had only one unpleasant experience, and curiously enough, it was with a downstairs neighbor in the house. But it was very, very, very slight, and ended up with a few words and nothing else.
How soon after the war did you go back to Budapest, and what were your impressions?
Well, I went back twice, actually 3 times. I went with her. The first time I went, a lot of my father's former co-workers had a sort of a get-together party. And I felt a lot out of place. I mean, not only because my Hungarian at that point wasn't very good, but because all of these people had survived the communist regime by becoming high functionaries in the government. I mean, I think the director of the factory was actually the Secretary of Commerce for Hungary at the time, and they all had very high positions in the. It was very nice in the fact that they did remember my father, and it was nice to hear them remember.
When was that?
Excuse me?
What year was that?
Oh, it was before I married her, 1962. 1962, 1963. It was in the middle of communist domination of Hungary, but it was, as I say, it was nice to be remembered.
Any other questions?
I just want to say this was, obviously a war story which ended in great success. We probably would never have met if it hadn't been under these horrific circumstances. And that, as Sam has told his story, we are very, very aware of people whose names we don't know, people who we don't know how to recognize as having been helpful, and the sense of humanity that has helped many, many families, and unfortunately so many other families were not able to survive.
Well, actually, I would like to say a few words about that.
And then we do have 2 more questions.
Okay.
That I see hands up.
What I'd like to say is that in fact it was not only this man in Mexico, an admiral who didn't know us, who wrote this letter for nothing but help. But for example, my mother at one point got pretty desperate, and since she couldn't move west, she was thinking of moving east, which is through Russia, through China. She went to the Russian embassy in Budapest, and the man took her, whatever it is, gave her a form. My mother filled out the form and left it with her. And as she was walking out, the man followed her. This consul followed her and said, look, when you come tomorrow, I'm going to give you a passport. But remember one thing, I can guarantee that you will go into Russia, but I cannot guarantee you that you will ever leave Russia. So she took the advice. But it went a long ways. For example, this thing in Spain, it was actually a two-way thing. Basically, it was going in, we had to have this inventory, which we didn't have. And going out, of course, the first thing that they asked is, where's the inventory? That was a very unpleasant experience because they started opening everything. Especially somebody had said that my mother had silver and God knows what, which she did, by the way. But she managed to steer them in such a way that they had to open the 18 bags which had nothing, and the 19th, which had the things, she threw a fit. And actually, there was there was actually a Hungarian football player which had helped us in Vigo. He had a restaurant in Vigo. And he was the one that said to the inspectors, you know, you've already seen too many things, just go, go, go. Again, somebody who had absolutely no reason to help us. Or, I mean, we went to his restaurant once or twice or whatever it is.
There was a question back here. Yeah.
What are some of the most important things you think the next generation should know?
I'll tell you very truthfully, the next generation should know that these things can happen and that they should learn somehow to avoid them. And the only way to avoid them is to redo the community. In other words, not to have a Hispanic community and the African American community and this community and that community. There should be one community, which is the American community. And this is what it used to be, and this is where people should reflect.
That's in an ideal world, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, of course.
I have a question. When all this was happening, you were 6 years old. Your sister was
14.
14. Your parents had to be quite young at the time, right?
Not so young. My father was 50, 49.
It's young.
Well, he started life again at 50. He basically started from literally zero at 50. My mother was in her late 30s, yes.
Okay,
But
so their parents, your grandparents, were alive at the time, probably, right?
not my father's. My mother's, there was just a grandmother, yes.
So your mother's mother was...
Yeah.
Did she accompany you?
No, she lived in Russia, and at that time Russia was Russia, was Bolshevik Russia.
Yes.
And even though we were only 300 or 400 miles from Kiev in Budapest, it was a world apart. It was a totally different world. No, my paternal grandparents passed away before I was born. And actually I was named for my maternal grandfather, which, you know, in Jewish Ashkenazi custom can only be done after somebody passes away. So it was really a year after my grandfather's passing away.
So were there aunts and uncles that you left?
There were aunts and uncles all over the place. There were, basically, my father was one of 13. And even though only 7 reached adulthood, they all had fairly interesting lives outside of Russia. My mother's family, on the other hand, remained in Russia. and they had interesting lives in Russia. But, you know, at that time this was a world in which there was very little communication between we couldn't, because first of all, Russia was blocked off. The Bolsheviks, you know, any letter, if you got 1 or 2 letters from a family in Russia a year, people were amazed that you got that many. The other part of the family was very busy. A lot of them were in the Middle East. A lot of them were original, should we say, they went to what is now Israel in the late 1890s, early 1900s. So there was sort of it was communication, but it was again once a year, once every 2 years. It was none of the proximity that you would have today.
I think we'll,
There's one more thing.
one more question?
Sure.
The gentleman mentioned the situation that we're in now as a country. And there's a book out, it's called They Thought They Were Free by Milton Meyer. And that book explains how the fascism and the Nazism was tiny little increments. It was a little bit here, and a little bit here, and a little bit over here. And by the time the people of Germany, now this book was written in 1955, and what Mr. Meyer did is he went back to Germany and he asked the factory workers, what was it that made you turn on your own people like this? And they used little tiny increments, and the gentleman had mentioned the present situation now. So we have to be careful. It's this, you attack this little group, and then you attack this little group, and then you attack these people, and it comes into this big ball. And I would suggest a lot of you read this book. It's called They Thought They Were Free by Milton Meyer. And it's an incredible, it gives you an understanding how this can possibly happen in this country, and it actually is happening in this country. And I applaud you for your courage here. You're such a beautiful man. I'm sorry.
Well,
Thank you.
I'll tell you one thing about Germany. We were discussing this with Lois the other day. It's amazing how many people and how many organizations were attacked in Germany, because it was either our way or the highway. And the attack went on and on and on. And there's actually a very interesting book. I don't know if people have heard of the Confessing Church. The Confessing Church in Germany was a church which stuck to orthodoxy. In other words, not to a national. The Germans were trying to make churches a national issue, and there were people who felt that their belief needs to be preserved as is. And the fact is that the people who wanted to preserve their belief as is were attacked viciously. Pastor Martin Niemöller lost his life in the issue, and he was one of the members of the Confessing Church. So basically, you have a situation which is, if you want to make a comparison of then and now, I would say this is the one thing which you have to be careful now. Everybody is being attacked. It depends on how early our president gets up, or in what mood he gets up, or what he hears that morning is the person or the organization that gets attacked. And again, I repeat, the word community is the great word that we should all remember, that America was a community, and no matter where you went or who you were an American. And this is a feeling which has to return. It's basic, and I hope it will be soon. I'm sure it will be, but the sooner the better. Anyway, thank you.
Before we close, Victor, did you want to tell folks about our opening?
Thank you, Sam, for being here.
You're very welcome.
Muchísimas
Thank you
gracias por su historia y por su todo aquí.
Muy amable, muchas gracias.
Excuse me?
Köszönöm szépen.
So.